Welcome back. It's the Scaling Secrets podcast where we talk about different problems that entrepreneurs, business owners face with scaling, with processes, with payroll, with mindset, with traffic, with PR, all these different things. And we're here with just the guy for you. His name is Avis bulbulyan, and he is a distinguished strategist and entrepreneur, turnaround specialist, renowned for his groundbreaking work in the cannabis industry. And Avis has navigated this complex landscape. He's pioneered novel strategies that have propelled him to the forefront of the field. So we're going to find out about Avis's expertise with Siva Enterprises, with how he's overcome all the usual hurdles that we deal with, plus some that you might not even have expected. So, Avis, glad to be speaking with you.
Thank you for having me, Robert.
Glad to have you. And so we introduced you, hyped you up a little bit, but in your own words, what are you up to? What's your current focus and passion?
So currently, we're dialing back on the consulting side and getting more involved with turnarounds and being a little bit more hands-on with the operations and bringing funding to the industry.
Wonderful. And so when turnaround, like I think I know what that means. I've known some like turnaround guys who come into a business and they kind of fix what's not working and like cut the fat, fix the accounting, fix the people, fix the operations. But when someone says, okay, turnaround, like what is that? What does that entail? What's your answer?
So there's a couple of things. Sometimes companies, as they're growing, they kind of lose their way, and they need somebody to come in from the outside and just really restructure them. You have companies that require financial turnarounds. You have companies that require operational turnarounds. Then you've got situations where you have founders that have built a company and they've taken it as far as they can take it, and they need somebody to come in and help them scale it beyond that point. And usually, what it takes to get from point A to point B is not necessarily what's required to go from point B to point C.
That's a good insight that sometimes it's like the founder has reached the end of their road, or you need to pivot or kind of just like restructure different kinds of thinking. And so out of these, like you mentioned, like the different types, right? There's like the financial or the operational or like the strategic or founder. Like, is there any one type of turnaround that really excites you more than the others, or are they all special and interesting?
Well, I love the operational turnarounds. The financial turnarounds, usually there's a lot of bad debt on the books and there's a lot of cleanup that goes into it. The really fun stuff for me personally is more of the operational turnarounds, where, especially in the cannabis industry, you have a lot of different dynamics involved. You've got heavy regulations, you've got tax issues, you have operator fatigue, and it's a revolving door. And a lot of times it's just fun to really come down, strip the company down, and really refocus on what their priorities are, what their goals are, what the company represents as a brand, as a company, and be able to kind of pivot and help them along in that way. And it can be a 6 month project, it can be a 2 year project, but it's the operational turnarounds that really get me excited.
Well, cool. And so you mentioned some of these sub pieces, right? There's like the processes, there's the branding, there's the goals and things like that. And so I imagine that there's a lot of like writing things down, talking to people, and like getting all this information in and having things come back out. But like, is there any sort of a like method to the madness when you come to one of these companies, especially like kind of like a cannabis company, and you have to like kind of work with all these moving parts, right? And figuring out where the branding is going wrong and figuring out how they lost their way. Like, what's kind of, are there any like steps involved? Is there a process to doing what you do?
Yeah, it really comes down to two things. It's managing expectations and managing people. A lot of times, especially when you're dealing with founders and founder CEOs, they're very stuck in their ways. They've been doing it a certain way, and a lot of times it's very difficult for them to give up the reins. And when you come in from as an outsider, you really need to be mindful of that. There's a couple of ways you go about it. Some people go about it saying, "Look, there's a reason why we were brought in. This is how it's going to be," and that just creates a lot of friction. The way we like to go about it is you kind of want to allow the leader to come up with the solutions with you guiding, being the guiding hand for them. So it's like you want to give them those options and not necessarily dictate terms to them. And when you can develop that sort of a friendly, collaborative environment with the people involved, whether it's the founder, whether it's their C suite, whether it's their employees, those are the ones that really end up creating a lot of momentum and a lot of buy-in. Because here's the thing: when you come in from the outside, you can create it's one thing to offer advice, it's another thing for that advice to be taken into consideration. And you really need to get that buy-in from the operational team for you to really be able to have the impact that you want to have.
And you're sure right that this idea of buying, it's so tricky, right? There's so much nuance to it that you could have this really good idea, or you can think that you know what needs to be done, but you need to get these people on board, right? You need to have them like excited about the plan, and maybe they had some participation in figuring out what the plan was. You gave them these various choices, and they decided, and that's very interesting, right? Dealing with the expectations, the emotions, the people, where there's like, your plan of action, your strategy. Say, here's what we need to do, but then you can have the best strategy, but if the people are not on board with it or in the way or just like reluctant or sabotaging or whatever, then like, you're on the foot and the gas at the same time, right? You like here's where we can go, but people are blocking you. And so these people skills seem to be like really important. And so to help us kind of understand, do you have a fun story to share with us? Like one of these companies that you jumped in with, you said, hey, like, let's figure out a plan, and you like dealt with the different kind of C-suite people that needed kind of convincing. Like what kind of story do you have to share with us about like the before and after magic?
Yeah, so before I go into the story, a lot of it is it's recognizing everybody has an ego, and there's nothing wrong with having an ego, but it's really being able to understand it. What I tell people is business really comes down to human nature, understanding human nature. If you can understand human nature, you can understand business. When we talk about turnarounds, nobody want if anyone has ever been through an audit, and when you go through a turnaround, what happens is you're the founder of a company, you're the CEO of a company, and all of a sudden you have this outsider that's coming in. And for all intents and purposes, you really have to just lift up your skirt and have everything be out in the open. And a lot of people are very obviously hesitant of that. They're skeptical of that. Um, they're afraid of their ego taking a hit. So we had a project, it was a cultivation project. We were brought in, and think about growers in the cannabis industry is the only time two growers ever agree on anything is when they agree the third one doesn't know what he's talking about. So we were brought in by more of like the financial guys to take a look at the operation and really just understand it and how it can be tweaked. And the grower, once we walked in, I knew I understand the mindset of a grower. So when I went in there, the grower is expecting somebody to come in and just point out everything that's possibly wrong with the operation. So we walked in, I'm like, look, give us the tour. Give us the tour, walk us through your process. And he's going through it. He's kind of skeptical. And I'm pointing out everything that he's doing right about the project. I'm like, wow, that's a really good idea. And a lot of times you kind of have to massage that ego. So I'm like, wow, that's really good. Didn't think of that. And as you're going through it, you notice what's wrong. But instead of calling out what's wrong, you're saying, look, have you thought about this? Or what about this? Or consider this? And then towards the end, we got to a point where the financial guys are the ones that brought us in to kind of audit the company and provide those key insights. You had the operational guy who was really key for that company's turnaround. If the operational guy was very resistant to it, there's no way you could have done what you do. So as we're going through it, by the end of it, it was the operational guy that was recommending for the financial guy to take it further and take that 6-month contract, turn it into more of like a 2-year ongoing consulting thing. So when you go in there, if you can set your ego aside and for a second take off your expert hat and pretend that you're not the expert, you can learn as much from them as they can learn from you. And to be an effective consultant, that's really what it is. You can be an expert and you decide you get into the consulting space. And in the consulting space, if you take on the position that you're the expert and you can't really be taught anything, at some point your expertise are going to become obsolete. At some point, your expertise are not going to be expertise anymore because the market's evolving. So if you can go into it not just as the teacher and the mentor, but also as the student, you're going to have a much longer career and you're going to be that much more effective.
And it's just a good habit in general, right? To be curious, to admit that you don't know what you don't know and that you know some things, but that you might not know this situation or that the marketplace has changed, or especially with cannabis, you hear so much like just the regulations alone, how much changes. And even just if you do think like there's no harm in being on the same page with someone. And then with as far as the managing the ego and the emotions, like this is also helpful advice here of don't just focus on the negativity, also look at what someone is doing right. So that way the negativity doesn't hurt that much. And so as far as you going in and like doing these audits and figuring out like what can be done and what can be done differently, what have, like you mentioned about how like learning is sometimes a two-way process. So is there anything noteworthy that you feel like you've learned in the last couple of years that you feel like passing along here?
Honestly, in the past couple of years, and every year for me, it's kind of like going through an MBA program without ever having gone through an MBA program. What I really love about the consulting space is one project you might be dealing with a group that's very finance heavy and understands finance. So as much as you're teaching them about why your background and why you were brought in, they're also teaching you. So and that's where it's like once you understand their world, now you can kind of bring their world and your world together and create that much better of a mousetrap. So it really is going into all these different projects with an open mindset, and a lot of people are afraid to admit what they don't know. So if I go into a project, whether it's a project that's very dominant on the compliance side or on the finance side, I go in there and say, look, you're hiring me to provide you with these inputs and the these set of insights. But for me to really be effective for you as a company, I need to understand where you're coming from. So as they're teaching you their world, you're also introducing them to your world. And that it's the merging of those two worlds. Because look, if you've got a group that's got a completely different background than you do, you can go in there, you can introduce all your different concepts. But if they don't understand how to apply their background to this industry, um, it's not going to be effective. For me, I go into a project looking for a way for me to replace myself with the group. Another thing is you get some situations where they bring in an outside consultant or an outside turnaround specialist. They come in guns blazing, stripping the whole thing down. But because they don't understand the backgrounds of the groups and what they have to work with, what ends up happening is after 6 months, after a year, they leave and they've just left the company in complete shambles, worse off than when they first entered into the relationship. So when you go into it, for business sustainability purposes, some people try to go in constantly creating more work for themselves. The way I like to think about it is if you go in there and you give the group and the team the tools that they need to succeed, you're always going to have work with them, and it's going to be different lines of works and different projects. So don't just focus on why you were brought in and try to prolong that engagement, because if you can effectively deliver on that project, you're going to get a lot more projects down the pipeline.
I like that a lot. That there's that tendency to apply the employee mindset of just like running out the clock or like delaying the clock. But you're saying, hey, there will be more problems to be solved. So solve the problem that's here because then you prove your value and you'll have other things to solve in the future. And I like your mindset here, right? This whole idea that it's easy for the negativity to creep in, but they hired you for a reason, right? They have some real problems and they want help. And everyone, like, ideally wants to put their brains together with this and solve this problem. And, like, I find myself sometimes tapping into that mentality. Like, if I'm in a situation where I'm kind of reluctant about being there. Like you think about when you got your driver's test to drive a car, like they want you to pass your driver's test, right? They want cars on the road. They want you to pay for gasoline and pay your car tax, but there are some obstacles in place. And even like was talking to an accountant a couple of weeks ago doing my taxes, and then I had to tell myself, well, hey, they want to provide this service. They want to be paid. They want to be helpful. They want to solve this problem. And sometimes it just takes the reminding ourselves of doing that. And so you mentioned about how like you go in there, you do your consulting, but you don't go in guns blazing, right? You don't give a lot of advice right away. But how do you kind of balance the wanting to be valuable and wanting them to kind of see the worth of what they paid you, even though you don't like give the advice right away and you're still asking the question? So how do you kind of balance that? How do you know when it's like the right time to switch into advice giving mode?
Actually, when I say going in guns blazing, what I meant was some folks go in there guns blazing, meaning they want to go in there and tear everything down. The way I go about it, guns blazing, is I do give them all the information that they're able to receive right out the gate, which is why a lot of times I'll price a project based on a project fee, not an hourly fee. With an hourly fee, one, besides the whole having to keep track of hours and all that stuff, with the project fee, it's like, look, you're paying me to take you from point A to point B. Now, whether I do that in 1 month or 6 months, the quicker I can do that for you, the better off you are. And you still get your money's worth. I don't need to stretch out what I can do in a day over a week for you to feel like you got your money's worth, because you're paying me for an objective, not for me to put in X amount of time into it. So as far as giving them out, you don't want to go in there and just unload everything at a point where they're not going to be receptive of that, or they're not going to be able to understand or process all the advice and information you're giving. So when you do go in there, you got to go in there 100%. If they're going to take value from your advice, it's on you to give that advice and not prolong it just so you can collect a couple more hours worth of billing. So again, it's really building them up, laying a foundation for your work, and slowly building it up, building it up, building it up. But as far as the information, I would never withhold information just to prolong the contract, which is why I also charge based on project fee, not an hourly fee.
Okay, very helpful. And so, and then as far as that kind of project fee pricing, that can be tricky, can't it? Because like if there's the worry of if you miscalculate and you say, well, I can do this for you, get you to this objective, and it will cost this, and it will probably take me this amount of time. If something is more time or more work than you expected, then you find that hourly rate that's like internally calculated, like getting smaller and smaller, right? Like if you miscalculate this. And so what is your thought process like as far as like pricing these sorts of things? Because there's the mindset of like, well, if I give them like a really good deal, or be like, well, if anything's possible, I might wave a magic wand, or I make this high price where like if they buy, then it's definitely worth my while. And how do you like navigate all of these like differing voices in the chorus, and how do you like kind of do this per project pricing?
So a lot of that comes down to experience. And I'll give you an example. When we were doing state licensing, we started off in Massachusetts back in 2012. From Massachusetts, went to Nevada, Illinois, New York, and we went through a bunch of different states and then came back to California. Now, California already had an existing industry that was transitioning from unregulated to regulated. And I knew what it would take to go from point A to point B, and I would charge based on project fee. And we lost a lot of business because of that, because a lot of people thought that we were overcharging. And then on the other hand, you have a lot of attorneys or a lot of consultants that don't have the experience, and they're taking a lot of things at face value. Oh yeah, it's not going to be difficult to do this process, and they're really undercutting it, and undercutting it by like 90%. So we did lose a lot of business, but I still maintain my reputation, because those people that were price shopping, for example, let's say if I was charging 100,000, another company was charging 10,000, and I knew it was impossible. But by losing that business and to that person that was charging 10,000, within a couple of months, that person understood that this is not a $10,000 project. So once they started up in their billing, now they have a pissed off client on their hand. That same client would come back to me a year later saying, look, now we get it. So one, a lot of that comes down to experience. Number two, yeah, you are going to have situations where you miscalculate something. For me, I would never go back to a client and say, look, I miscalculated, I need to charge you more. That's on me, that's not on the client. Now, that said, you do build in contingencies. You say, look, you're paying me this project, this is what it encompasses. I will deliver all that. These are things that are not covered by the project. You don't necessarily need them now, but should these needs arise, the contract would also need to be modified, and not necessarily modified. We need to engage, we need to have a secondary engagement or a third engagement that encompasses these additional aspects. So I'll give you an example. We take a lot of projects on where we're taking them through the initial process of whether it's raising capital, applying for a license, getting their business set up. Once they get their license, now they need management services. I don't tie them into a management services agreement, because it's like what you think you need from a management company today is going to be very different fast forward a year from now. So let's get to that point of you having a license. If you're happy with the services I provided, we can always enter into that agreement. So then once they get their license, now we enter into a management agreement, versus saying, okay, I'm going to charge you for this now. A year later, the management agreement's going to kick in. It creates unnecessary boundaries and a bad relationship with the client right out the gate. You don't want to create that level of dependency for that long of a project, because here's the reality. Maybe you don't hit it off with the client and you want to exit the engagement. If you're tied up, it's a two-way street. Now you're tied up with it for the next 2-3 years, now wanting to be involved.
That's helpful, and I can definitely see how just the experience speaks to you. Kind of have like you know what to say, you know what the template is, and that's also really cool how you say, well, here's the scope of the project. and here's also what's maybe a nice idea or things that could be done, but that's a separate project, and that kind of sets the boundaries, right? And sets the expectations as we're talking about here. And so since this is the Scaling Secrets podcast, there's all sorts of like different ways we can go with that, right? And there's always like just different exciting kind of problems and solutions when we're talking about scale. And especially in the cannabis industry, I mean, it's like you make a mistake and that's a big problem. And so as far as like what you've done and kind of the secrets that you've picked up over the decades, when I ask you about scaling secrets, like what comes to mind? What sort of things should we know about like scaling a business, or what have you done as far as scaling?
So on the services side, scaling takes on a little bit different of a life. So it's not a product. Well, you have a product to sell, but it's really based on the individuals that you're selling. You're selling their knowledge. So there's three ways to go about it on the consulting side or any sort of professional services side that you're doing. You only have so many hours in a day. You can be a one-man show, bill out your hours, bill out your time, bill out your projects, but there's only so many projects you could take. The next level up from that, if you want to scale it, some people, what they'll do is they're the primary expert. They'll bring in supporting staff for them. So they'll unload some of the more basic day-to-day work. But again, you're very limited on how much you can scale. When you really want to scale a services business to kind of be like the McKinsey's and any of those top consulting companies, you kind of need to set aside your own personal ego and bring in people that are a lot more sophisticated. They have a lot more expertise on any given thing. So now you kind of end up turning a situation where you are the expert into more of you being, and I don't like to use this word, but being more of like the salesperson. So you're out there, you're pitching it, but the people that you have working for you in any given field, they're probably a lot more of an expert than you are individually. So where, for instance, in my case, where I might have broader knowledge and expertise on all the different things from finance to operations to marketing to branding, my finance guy is a hell of a lot smarter than I am when it comes to finance. My branding guy in the branding world, my operations guy in the operational world. So it's kind of replacing yourself by taking your knowledge, breaking it apart, and bringing in people that are a lot smarter than you. Some people aren't comfortable with that, having to manage a team of experts that are smarter or more of an expert than they are. But if you really want to scale a services business, that's really the way you got to go about it. If you're a law firm, yes, you can be a one-man lawyer. Yes, you can be a one-man lawyer, hire assistants and paralegals and legal assistants, or you can be a lawyer that brings in other lawyers and you start scaling like that. So you have to understand the field that you're in, and you have to understand how do you leverage and scale your specialties.
And so, and in my mind, I'm picturing like kind of these three different models, or basically like there's like one to one, one to many, and then many to many, right? Like that middle one is like the one to many is like you kind of chop up your knowledge and hire out this team, but you're saying the real scaling magic happens when you become the salesperson or the spokesperson or whatever you want to call it. Like you're the one bringing the business, and then these other experts do the work. And even like the way you described it, it's so cool to think about. Like, we always have like all these different tasks we do and all the switching of gears, and it's like, well, what if you had some employee and all they did was this one thing and they got really good at it and they got even like better at you than it, and they had focus and they kind of had that kind of the recurring thinking, and they could kind of think on like a high level and strategize and make sure that the ball wasn't dropped. Like that's a really powerful place to be, as long as we can solve a lot of the problems in getting there, right? No one said that that was easy or instant, but if we can figure out a path to go from maximizing out our time into having this like this real machine where like many other things are possible, then that's where we really want to be. And as long as we kind of overcome the struggles. And so as far as you and your own struggles, Mr. Avis, what have you kind of fought with, like as far as we all go through our own kind of personal transformation and solve interesting problems, have you kind of gone through any real like problems on your path to getting here?
Oh, many. I mean, I don't think you can. I don't think you can scale without encountering problems, without having to overcome adversity. And a lot of the adversity is just personal, internal, and being able to overcome that. sometimes you go on a streak where everything really comes across as very easy, and then you start questioning yourself. It's like, well, it shouldn't be this easy. So, um, yeah, I mean, look, when I talk about scaling, it's really there's different levels to everything in life, even in business, and every level comes with its own set of rules and its own set of guidelines on how things work and how things operate. And you really need to start learning that. So when you go from this level to this level, well, you understand this world, but now you need to understand that world. And that's where a lot of the friction comes in, where it's like, okay, I need to drop certain beliefs I have about what I do and how I do it, and I need to start adopting these criteria. So then you end up going through that transition. You kind of mold and you get to that level. You operate in that world a little bit. Then you see opportunities to take another step up and level up again. And now you need to go back into that student mindset and kind of, you need to drop all the stuff that you wouldn't be able to carry over into that new level. And you need to recognize what does translate and transfer over into that new role. And that's what really scaling is. It's being able to recognize what the new rule set is and being able to adapt and adopt to that rule set. The hardest part, that's the personal side of it. The hardest part on a company executive level where you're trying to take your company along with you is also getting that under level of understanding and buy-in from your supporting staff, whether it's your C-suite, whether it's the middle staff, whether it's your general employees, because the same mindset switch that you need to do, they also need to do. So that's where working as a team was really beneficial. I had a situation in 2018 where I had employees that didn't have that buy-in, and they decided to go off on their own. Along the way, they caused a lot of damage to the company. So for me, I just had to go overcome all that, overcame it, went on to the next level, and then just out of everybody's hands, COVID shut down everything. And for me, where a lot of our work at the time was dealing with state agencies and local agencies, if they're shut down, you really have no business. So now you go from going 100 miles an hour, all of a sudden you're at zero. So then it's that whole mindset, and you have to wait it out and start planning your moves for when businesses do reopen. And then as you're going through it, like right now, we're going through a point in this industry where the DEA is about to come out with a rescheduling decision on cannabis. That's going to drastically alter the entire landscape. Now, you can either look at it as bad or as good. The way I like to look at it is, it just is. So if you can understand the way things are, it's like, okay, take out my bias. Take out the fact that I like it or I don't like it. I just need to understand what it is. If I can understand what it is, I can understand where the opportunities are, and that's where you can adapt. If you're not adaptable in any business, you're not going to be able to scale anything.
That's very helpful, right? Like if you don't adapt, then you yourself become the bottleneck, and this leveling up concept, you'll stop doing it, right? You'll get to the level where you kind of reached your peak, and that's a scary place to be, and we don't want that. And so this is helpful to think about just in terms of how optimism does not mean being ignorant. Optimism does not mean burying your head in the sand. Optimism just means being like, okay, what's going on? What are the facts? What's the situation? And then what is the good in this, or what are the opportunities that I have in front of me? And you think about, as you go through these different levels, you say that you look at what are the different rule sets, and then in each level you kind of retake this inventory about your own skills and knowledge and capabilities and team, and figure out like what do you take with you and do you discard. And it's really cool to think about this in these abstract terms, instead of just like wandering through life and just accepting what life gives you. If we can kind of do some of these hard things and make the decisions and go for these strategies that need to be gone after, then we can really get somewhere. We can accomplish some amazing things and find this sort of fulfillment. So if someone has been wowed and amazed by some of the insights that you said, like just like I've been pretty wowed and amazed, and they want to find out about you and your company and your contact details, what's the next step? What's the call to action?
Well, the call to action is you can email us. Our website is sivallc.com, SIVALLC.com. Our social media handles are Siva Knows Best. You can send us an email at info@sivallc.com. The main thing is just don't be afraid of the unknown. You can either sit there, cry about it, or you can actually do something about it. You don't like where your life's at, do something about it, move forward. One thing I understood about business in general is the world of business doesn't care. Um, Fast forward a year, 2 years, 5 years, You don't want to be in a situation where you're always thinking about the past, thinking about how could things have been, how unfortunate it is, because look, at the end of the day, nobody cares. Your family cares. Beyond that, nobody cares.
And it's counterintuitive, right? Nobody cares can be freeing, can be motivating, can be inspiring as long as you look at it the right way. And the next thing to do as far as making that change is go to SIVALLC.com. That's SIVALLC.com. And Avis said info@SIVALLC.com. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
All right. And then Siva knows best on social media. We've been talking to Avis Bulbulyan. That's last name Bulbulyan. Just talking about some of these things that we need to know and apply, right? As far as our inner game and our out of game and get your business to where it should go and scaling it. And Avis Bulbulyan, who is a business strategist, cannabis policy expert, and turnaround specialist. You can find him at SIVALLC.com. And thank you very much, Avis, for being raw, authentic, vulnerable, personal, sharing these life and business lessons with us. I really appreciate you.
Robert, thank you very much for the time.
All right.